Rather than picking a text and going through it, what I want to do today, my Bible class back at Alum Creek, my teen class that I've been teaching, we just finished the book of Judges. And so past couple weeks, we've been doing a little bit of review, and we just had a little test on it and everything. And I was going back over the book of Judges and with them and just with myself and looking at everything we learned. And I developed this lesson kind of as a survey of the entire book of Judges. And so I want to try that today, and well, we'll see how it goes, I guess. But I just want to go through it and try and pick up on the big lessons out of Judges. I think it's important when we get to the end of a book to say, what's the big idea? What do we gain from the book as a whole? And not, we gained a lot from all the fine details, all the chapters and verses, but when you look at the big picture, a survey style, just what's the whole book of Judges talking about? What's the big idea of it? That's what I want to talk about a little bit today in our Bible class. So, just to get us started, I want to hear from you guys. I like a little bit of back and forth on when it comes to Bible class. What do you think of when you think of the book of Judges? What comes to your mind? Is there a certain story that comes to your mind, or a certain theme, or anything along those lines?
Well, one thing I think of when I think of Judges, it's a kind of a transitional book, because it takes you from when we had a single leader like Moses or Joshua, and then we're getting into the kings.
Yes.
Okay, and Samuel's the last of the judges, and so he takes you right into Saul, the first king. And then, there's a succession of judges. I don't know if you probably know since you went through Judges how many there were. Probably 10 or 12 or something like that, I'm thinking. But and there were, the personalities were very different.
For sure.
So the first thing that hits me is kind of a transitional book. Takes us from the single leader who's been there for a while to the king.
Absolutely. It's very significant to place kind of where we're at in history at this point. We've just come off of Genesis through Deuteronomy, as he was talking about, with Moses being their leader, and then you had Joshua, and then this is just kind of what happens in between Joshua as leader and going into the kings and going into kingships being established here. So, in thinking about that, and a transitional period, I like how you phrased that. Were transitions like that did they always go smoothly? There was usually some rough patches when it comes to transitions, right? There still is today. When we have a change go on, there's definitely a little bit of friction sometimes at the very least. And so when we're talking about the book of Judges, there was a lot of friction. There was a lot of troubling times throughout the book of Judges, and it's often looked at as the dark ages in Bible history. And so I like that, a transitional period. Does anybody else have any other thoughts on that?
Most people don't like changes.
Right.
They like to keep it just like it is.
Yeah, it's a lot of people just don't like change. You got that right. And so, was there any other thoughts?
Judges were a time when the Israelites, they would sin, they'd be punished for their sins by a nation that would cause great harm to them. And then would come a judge to bring them out of that wartime with those nations. In other words, a leader for them to conquer that nation even more. So it was a time when the Israelites were sinning and falling and being raised up again by a judge.
Right. And then after they were raised up by those judges, usually what followed was ultimately sin again, right? And there's kind of a cycle going on. We're going to come back to that cycle in just a minute, but thank you for bringing that out. So yeah, there's a few of these things we've already mentioned. We know about the book of Judges. What I want to do starting off is kind of give similar to what I would give as introductory material going into a book. And then we're going to talk a little bit about just the content of Judges. What are some of the stories you read if you read the book of Judges? And then we'll finish it off by talking about just what we can gain from the book of Judges, talking about the theme of the book and what we should ultimately be, what our conclusion should be after we read the book of Judges as Christians. What's the application we can take today? So, we'll just begin here. I want to bring out one verse to start us off, and that's the very last verse in the book, Judges chapter 21 and verse 25. Again, that's Judges chapter 21 and verse 25. I think this gives a pretty good description it helps us understand what we're going to see within the book. It says in verse 25, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." This same phrase is repeated in Judges chapter 17 and verse 6. But when you look at the book of Judges, you have to understand this is a very important point. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. In other words, everyone set their own moral code. I drew this out on a whiteboard for my teen class, and do I have a board here?
Yeah, right there.
Okay. Do I have a marker?
Now, that's good. I gotta see if I stick my hand in one of those classrooms. Look, in,
There, I think there's one over there.
oh, okay.
So there is a lot of changes then from beginning to.
Absolutely. Aha. So I drew this out for my teens, and I'll try and do the same thing here. When it says in chapter 21, verse 25, everyone did what was right in their own eyes, I want you to understand that, most of us, every last one of us understands that there's some things that are right, and there's some things that are wrong. And so you have, and that's the worst handwriting I've ever seen in my life, but you've got some things that are objectively right, no matter which way you look at it, and you've got some things that are objectively wrong, no matter which way you look at it. Now, ultimately, who sets the moral code? Who says what's right and what's wrong? God. So, here, I like to think of this line right here as God's moral code. He's set this code through Scripture and said, everything above this line is what's right, everything below this line is what's wrong. That's not what you had in the book of Judges. God had already established the old law at least, but in that time, there were people saying, well, I think a couple things in here are gray areas, so I think, everything below this line is wrong, everything above this line is right. And there was some people drawing a line right here and saying, well, I'm okay with doing a little bit more than that. He says these are wrong, but I don't really think they're wrong, so I'm going to draw my line right here. Basically, what you have is everybody's drawing a line, and what's the result? Chaos. Did somebody say that? That's exactly right. You have absolute chaos because God's line gets kind of foggy. There's all these different lines being set, and ultimately there ends up being no line. There ends up being no moral code. And so that's what you can see going on throughout the entire book of Judges, is that everyone's doing what was right in their own eyes, and the result of it, there's no morality. There's no moral code.
But they lost Joshua, didn't they, at the beginning?
That's exactly right.
He was a good leader.
So, the result of this, the result of not having the moral code is you've got some dark times. You've got some bloody and gory times, and some times that are truly hard to read about. And if you don't believe me, just hang in there, because we're going to look at a couple of them. But that's the quick and fast way of me introducing the book of Judges. I think that's sets the stage for us a little bit. So now we'll talk a little bit about what we see just moving through the book of Judges. Again, we're not going to sink in real deep on any parts of the book. I just want to look at this as a survey, just get the big idea of it, and hopefully within a reasonable amount of time. So in chapter 1, you have a little bit of background. The book of Joshua ends with the partial conquest of Canaan. You know, the people of Israel have gone into Canaan, and God said to take the land and make it theirs, and to not let the Canaanites inhabit the lands along with them. In chapter 1, we read about some of that continual conquest, some of the ways they continued to drive out the Canaanites, and then we also read about in the end of chapter 1 how they didn't drive out some of the Canaanites, how they let some of them live there beside them, even though that's not what God wanted. And so that's what we get in chapter 1. And then in chapter 2, we see the cycle that was brought out to us a few minutes ago over there. There's a cycle that's seen throughout the book of Judges, and you can read about it in verses about 11 through down through the chapter. I don't know exactly when it stops there, but when we read these verses, we see a cycle going on. We see first sin, and then we see, I'll draw this out too since I've got the marker handy and all. So we always start with sin. That's always where the people of Israel started off going wrong. And then as a result of that sin, you came to a time of oppression. There'd be another tribe, another people. Some of the Canaanites would come and oppress the people of Israel. They'd kind of hold a thumb over them. That nation would come in and kind of be a bully to Israel, and they'd have oppression, and they'd deal with this oppression for a little while. And you see this throughout the whole book of Judges. It starts off in chapter 3 and it goes on through the entire book. You have oppression going on, and they take this oppression for a little while, but eventually they get tired of it. And so what happens next? The people cry out to God. So you have crying out here as the next step in our cycle. They cry out to God, and the people landed themselves here by themselves. It's their sin that caused them to fall into this oppression. So God didn't really need to answer their crying out. It's not on him that they continue to fall into sin and therefore fall into oppression. But nonetheless, when the people cry out, God raises up a judge and delivers the people. So the next step's deliverance. And I don't know if I'm making this big enough. I hope I am. But after the crying out to God, God answers the people. He raises up a judge and delivers them. And once they're delivered by this judge, they have rest in the land. It says at the end of each of these sections, the people had rest for 40 years. They had rest for 27 years. And it just tells you how long they have rest. And then usually right after that verse it says, again, the people did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. And so they fall back into sin. They fall back into oppression. They cry out again. God answers again. And thus goes the entire cycle of the book of Judges. So I think that's one very important thing for us to see. And you see it play out there through chapter 2. And so that's important for us to see. And then in chapter 3, we start reading all kinds of different stories. Now, does anybody have any stories in their minds that come to mind when they think of the book of Judges? Memorable stories? Samson is a very important one, and we're going to get to him. And he's in chapters 13 through 17 there. Who else stands out in your mind? Jael. Yes, in chapter 4. Gideon. Gideon's one of my favorite judges, I guess I would say. And we always remember Gideon's 300 in that story. There's a lot of memorable stories.
Anybody mention Deborah yet?
No.
I figured somebody might throw that in.
Yeah, so there's a lot of very memorable stories in the book. But I mentioned this was a dark time. I mentioned it was a bloody and gory time. And honestly, if I was going to give the book of Judges a rating, it wouldn't be G or PG. And some of it might fit under PG-13, but really most of it is rated R. Most of it is for mature audiences only, because there's a lot of things going on in here. And so in chapter 3, we read of a judge by the name of Ehud, who his job, he's raised up so that he can deliver the people from King Eglon. And it says in the text in chapter 3 and verse, I believe it's verse 17. Yes, the end of verse 17. In my translation it says, "Now Eglon was a very fat man." And my teens definitely found that comical. To hear that about the king, it's pretty blunt about the fact that this was a very big man. But we read if we go down and read through chapter 3, you read the story of Ehud deceiving the king and going into his inner chamber and stabbing this king with a sword and impaling him with this 18-inch dagger, and the dagger being totally consumed by the man, and the man being spilled out onto the ground. And this is just chapter 3. I told you it gets to be a pretty dark book. And then you get into chapter 4, and we meet Jael, who was mentioned over there, and Jael drives a tent peg into Sisera's head to kill him. And so it's just one more story that we read in the book of Judges. And then we continue to read the book of Judges, and you go to chapter 9. I know I'm skipping forward a little bit, but I skipped right over Gideon. But this is Gideon's son, whose name was Abimelech. And Abimelech was one of 71 sons of Gideon. We often refer to Gideon as having 70 plus 1 sons. That's because one of his sons was born from a concubine, that son being Abimelech. And we read about Abimelech, and we come to find out that after Gideon's death, somebody had to take over Gideon's rule. And Abimelech wanted to take over that rule, but there were 70 other brothers in the race to become the next ruler. And so what does he do? He kills all 70 of his brothers, except for one. One of them makes it away, but the more we read into this book, the darker it gets. You have this man killing 70 of his brothers just for the sake of power, ultimately. And then I heard Samson mentioned too. We'll fast forward a little bit more and go to Samson. And Samson probably has the longest rap sheet of them all. Samson, if you read about him, you read in just in chapter 14 that he tears a lion into pieces with his bare hands, leaves it for a few days, and then comes back to eat out of its carcass. And then you continue reading about Samson, and you learn that he tied 300 foxes tail to tail, and he lit them on fire and sent them out into the field to cause destruction to the Philistines. And then you continue reading in the next chapter, and Samson's striking down 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey. Samson's got some pretty interesting stories behind him, and that's never mind considering all the women that he had relationships with. He had his first wife, who was a Philistine, who he wasn't supposed to marry, and he has this relationships with her and ends up burning down her household along with her whole family. And then he has a relationship with a prostitute, and then he goes and has a relationship with a woman who we know by the name of Delilah, who tries to have him killed on multiple occasions.
He wasn't supposed to cut his hair.
No, and that was part of the Nazirite vow, right? We're familiar with the Nazirite vow, and there was 3 parts of that vow. The one was to not shave the head or trim the beard, and the second part of that vow was to not have anything to do with alcohol, and the third part of the vow was to not touch anything unclean, not to touch anything that was dead. And you read the story of Samson and you say, wait a minute, he broke all three of those. And so Samson's got a pretty interesting story. We read a lot of different stories in the book of Judges, and one of my least favorite, one of the hardest to read for me is in chapter 19, where a Levite and his concubine are traveling, and they go to a stranger's house to stay, and they're invited in, and that night, it says, wicked men, worthless fellows of the town come and take this concubine and abuse her and violate her and ultimately kill her. So you have some dark, dark stories in the book of Judges. Now these stories invoke, have I missed any stories? Have I missed anybody's favorites? we were just kind of going through, like, hearing some of the stories we read. I don't know if I was just making sure I didn't miss any, but there's definitely a few more in there. But
I like Samson.
yeah, Samson's certainly got an interesting history. Now, these stories they create a lot of different responses in us, right? What are some ways in which we might respond to these stories? When you hear these stories, what's your response? Wow, might be one of them. You might be amazed to hear all the crazy things that happen within the book. Anyone else? You know,
One thought I have is that stories like these, to me, trying to think of the word I want to use, legitimizes the truth of the Bible. I mean, it adds to its authenticity. Okay?
Right.
To show that it was from God, because, you know, for instance, if we write a biography, an autobiography, what do we concentrate on? We concentrate on the good things that we did in
Right.
our life. We don't concentrate on the bad things we did in our life. Probably don't even mention the bad things that we did in our life, okay? But in a book like Judges, you find it other places too, the good and the bad's laid out.
yeah,
Right? And some of these, you know, all these judges, if I'm not mistaken, are people of God. I mean, they're Israelites.
right.
And they should be God's people. They should be doing the right thing. And they're not the lily white guys
No.
always.
It's much like it's a lot like social media today. We kind of put our best foot forward on social media, don't we? We post these the Happy New Year celebration with our family, and we're all there together, and we're all happy and having a good time. But we didn't post about the bad time that we had, you know. And so when you look at social media, it'd be easy to look at someone's life and say, "Wow, you know, they live a perfect life," but that's just because we only want to share the good things. And so, yeah, you definitely got a point there.
I have a question. It said that he judged the Philistines for 20 years.
Right.
Did he judge more other than the Philistines?
I'm sorry, can you?
Said Samson judged during the Philistines
Yes.
20 years. And did he judge beyond the 20 years?
No. Well, typically when it says that he judged for 20 years, it typically means that he judged for 20 years and then he died. Usually it says they judged for this amount of time before their eventual death. What chapter and verse are you in particularly?
It's the end of 15,
Into 15?
20, 15.
Uh,
15 verse 20. Says he judged Israel.
Oh, I see what you're saying now, because we haven't come to the time of Samson's death yet.
That's okay. I mean,
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I think I think the best answer I can give you right now is that he judged the people for 20 years, and then chapter 16 goes into the story of where his time of judging ends, because he meets Delilah, and he is shortly thereafter captured by the Philistines. And so I think that's the best answer I can give you right now.
Well, I can add to it for you. In the last verse of chapter verse 31, it says that he died. We know when he died, but they buried him between Zorah and Eshtaol in the burying place of Manoah his father, and he judged Israel 20 years.
Yeah, he had.
So the total judging period evidently was 20 years.
Yes. Yeah. So yeah, that's where we land with that. You know, he had the 20 years of judging, and then he meets Delilah and he's eventually captured there by the Philistines. His total time of judging was 20 years. So,
It might be notable, the worst, to say also that the judges weren't in immediate succession.
right.
I mean, there was maybe a period of time between the last judge and the next.
Yeah, when we read those periods of rest, they had rest for this many years. It only takes one verse for us, so if we're just reading through the stories, then we kind of skim over it. We're like, this person died, and then there was rest for 37 years, and then we go to this. But 37 years is kind of a significant period of time. What's going on in that time? So it's kind of along the same lines. I count 12 judges within the book, not 12 judges total. You also have Eli and Samuel that come along later, but I counted 12 judges in the book, and there's 6 major judges and 6 minor judges. But we don't call them minor judges because they are less significant. We just call them minor judges because there's less written. There's only 1 or 2 verses about a couple of them, but that doesn't mean their story's any less significant it just means that there's less written about them. So.
Another thought too in this is that, the Israelites are condemned for wanting a king.
Mm-hmm.
But they have just come through this period of judges where they had no king.
Right.
They had no leader like Moses or Joshua to lead them. What they had was a judge, and then a period of time when nobody could lead them, and then another judge. So I can see where the Israelites, when they're thinking, we need somebody to lead us consistently all the time. Therefore, we need a king.
Right. Right.
The other nation.
Yeah, I think after a certain amount of time, these people they may start to see that their way doesn't work. Right now they're doing what's right in their own eyes, and what's right in their own eyes is to do whatever makes them happy. And then when things don't go right for them because they've fallen into sin, then judges raised up. But ultimately, those judges aren't remembered. Ultimately, once they die, soon after they fall off the map because the people fall into sin again. So. That's definitely a good point there. But back to talking about our response to these stories. She mentioned, wow, we're certainly amazed by some of the stuff happening in here. There's a lot of other responses too. In our world of entertainment, there's, we hear stories that do get graphic, whether you're talking about violence or whether you're talking about this or that or the other. But sometimes when you read the book of Judges, you get to thinking, well, God would have been a pretty good TV producer. He'd have made some pretty good movies. When you look at this, you might have a little bit of that response, and then of course, a younger man reading this might read these stories and say, well, that's pretty cool. Listening to Samson killing 1,000 men with the jawbone of a donkey, he says, well, that's pretty cool. So it invokes a lot of different responses, and sometimes there's even, in some weird way, a little bit of humor in there, talking about the king being a very fat man. But there's a lot of different responses that come from the book of Judges, but I don't think they're, I want to look at the big picture now. I want to talk about the whole book. When we read all these stories, there's a response that we ultimately should have, and it's not any of them that we've mentioned so far. When we read these stories, we need to understand something. These are stories of broken people. I've often heard the book of Judges describe, the theme of Judges titled as a broken people and a faithful God. And I think it's very accurate, but right now what we're seeing reading these stories is the part of the broken people, the people that no matter how many times they're oppressed and no matter how many times they're delivered, they continue to fall back into sin. And these leaders that are raised up, these judges that are raised up, supposed to be these righteous men of God to deliver the people and be the good guys, they end up just as wicked, if not more so, than the people they're delivering. They fall into sins themselves. And I think based on all that, based on what kind of stories we're reading from that perspective, the appropriate response to these stories ought to be for us to lament for these people. We look at these stories and we shouldn't, of course we're going to have our other responses, but ultimately when we read the book of Judges, it ought to be cause for us to lament, because these people didn't have anyone to lead them in the right direction. I mentioned earlier there was no moral code, but not only that, there was really no morally upright character within the book. You may be able to dig and find someone doing something right, but ultimately, if you keep reading about the same character, you find a lot of other things that they did wrong. And so, I'm not claiming that anyone's perfect, but these people are they're a lot better described as wicked than, I don't like that way of phrasing it, but they, these people, they're not morally upright. And because of that, and in addition to that, they don't have anyone around them who is to lead them in the right direction.
Is it a drastic change from Moses to them now? Because Moses, they had him for
Right.
some time.
And
When I opened it, I said they lost, I meant they lost Moses and had Joshua. But was it a drastic change there?
well, yes and no. But yes and no. I mean, Moses and Joshua, they weren't perfect leaders. We certainly read about a couple things they did wrong as well. But so from that aspect, no, nothing's changed. We're still talking about sinful man. But also yes, because these are, when we read the book of Judges, we need to recognize that they're incredibly dark times. They're the darkest times that we read about. I've heard Judges described as a collection of the worst Bible stories, and I think that's accurate to a great extent. So I think that was important for us to recognize, what our response should ultimately be to the book of Judges. And now I want to hone in. I think we have maybe about 10 minutes left in class. I want to hone in now on what we can gain from the book of Judges. What's the take home? What do we get out of it as Christians? And so we've already talked about, the book's about a broken people and a faithful God. But we see throughout the book the part of the broken people where we see the faithful God is that he continues to answer them. He continues to not give up on them. Matter of fact, one time stands out in chapter 10 of Judges, where after the story of Tola and Jair, two of the minor judges, again, not that they're less significant, just there's less written about them. The first 5 verses of chapter 10 covers them both. So, whereas some judges had 3 and 4 chapters written about them, like Samson and Gideon. But after those two, you have in verse 6, it says, the people of Israel again did what was evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals and the Ashtaroth. Continuing on, the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he sold them into the hand of the Philistines and the hand of the Ammonites, and they fell into oppression. Verse 10, the people of Israel cried out to the Lord, saying, we've sinned against you. And the Lord says in verse 11, did I not save you from the Egyptians and from the Amorites, from the Ammonites and from the Philistines? The Sidonians also and the Amalekites and the Maonites oppressed you, and you cried out to me, and I saved you out of their hand. Yet you've forsaken me and served other gods, therefore I will save you no more. Go and cry out to the gods whom you've chosen. Let them save you in this time of your distress. This is where we see what our human brains would say is the appropriate response from God. We see him saying, let these other gods that you've chosen save you. You keep crying out to these gods, or you keep trying to serve these idols, so see how your golden calf's going to save you. And the people realize that calf's not going to do anything for us. We need the true God. And so they cry out once again to him, and what does God do? Well, you read it there in verse 15, people of Israel said, we have sinned, do to us whatever seems good to you, please deliver us this day. And so they put away their foreign gods and served the Lord. And then you have the story, and then you run into the story of Jephthah where they're once again delivered. So, something interesting for us to see. We realize that God continues to be faithful to these people when they truly, truly don't deserve it. Much like we don't deserve God's mercy today. But we need to understand that the people are very broken. And the sin of these people is the point of the book. One verse I want to point out to us just real quick. You don't have to turn over there with me, but I'm going to read out of Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32. A chapter that we often refer to as the Hall of Faith, where we list all these faithful people. Again, that's Hebrews chapter 11 and verse 32. If I can get there. Hebrews chapter 11 verse 32 reads, and what more shall I say? For time would fail me to tell of Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah, of David, and Samuel, and the prophets, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of the lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, and put foreign armies to flight. We see a couple of those characters from the book of Judges, Gideon, Barak, Samson, Jephthah. We see them mentioned there in the Hall of Faith. There's something important to note here. A lot of times we read in Hebrews chapter 11 and we see these examples of faith, if that'd be the right way to put it, and then we see these men listed and we say, well, these men, even though they had their sin and had their downfalls, they were ultimately faithful to God. They were ultimately good men that we could learn from, right? But I want to make something clear here. The last we read of Gideon in the book of Judges, he's beating and killing men out of vengeance, and he's stuck in idolatry. Gideon dies an idolater. Samson, another one mentioned in Hebrews chapter 11, we've already talked about him a little bit. He's a womanizer, that he has all these relationships with women, and he died through suicide, taking vengeance on all his enemies in the process. Jephthah, who we read about in Hebrews chapter 11, Jephthah sacrificed his daughter as a result of a foolish vow. We didn't even talk about that one. Back in chapter 11, Jephthah does an awesome job delivering Israel there in the beginning, but toward the end of his life, Jephthah makes a vow that, God, if you deliver the people, then I'm going to commit whatever is the next thing to come through my door to you, and I'm going to sacrifice it and let it be yours. And of course, he's referring to an animal sacrifice, but the next thing to walk through his door is his daughter. So now, does he go back on his vow to God and disobey him in doing that by not fulfilling his vow, or does he kill his daughter? We know God never approved of child sacrifice. So he made a foolish vow, and even though Jephthah did some good in delivering Israel, that's ultimately what he was remembered for, is his foolish vow. And then, just all these stories you read, these people didn't die faithful to what we can tell. They didn't. it's not a situation where we can look at these people's lives and say, well, they weren't perfect, but there's still some things we can learn from how they lived and use them as an example. That's not really the case. These people are named in Hebrews chapter 11. Is that the 5 minutes or the end?
Yeah.
5 minutes? Okay. Okay, we're going to burn through this real quick. These people are named in Hebrews chapter 11 to highlight how God worked through their faith at some point in their life. It's not to say that we can learn from something about them. I would actually make the case that we should not look at these people and say that we can learn from their example. I think that's important to note since we're talking about the book of Judges. But the sin and brokenness of man in that day was the point. Both the people of Israel in general and the judges that were raised up, all of them were sinful and broken. And even when through God, these judges had great strengths, they ultimately had greater weaknesses, and they were remembered for their weaknesses. And when they died, they weren't remembered for a long time. The people fell back into sin. There was nothing remembered of the victories that they had and the things they accomplished. So, what is the big idea from the book of Judges? What can we take home? The book of Judges leaves us longing for a righteous judge, one that stood up and was selfless and did right, and whose name was remembered, who brought better deliverance for the people of Israel. And we don't get that out of any of the judges we read about. It leaves us longing for one of those. But I'm here to tell you that today we have received such a judge, and his name is Jesus. We've received a righteous and selfless judge that will deliver us from our sin, will answer our cries to him, and will provide ultimate rest. I've been reading a book from Wes McAdams. It's titled Beyond the Verse, What I Learned or What I Discovered Reading the Bible One Book at a Time. And what he's been doing is basically approaching books of the Bible from a survey standpoint, kind of like this, and he just wrote an article on what he got from the big idea of the book, and then he ends it by relating it to Jesus, because the entirety of the Bible points to Jesus. You look at any book in the Bible, and it may be a book of dark times, it may be a book of a lot of different things, and we may read of a lot of different people, and it may be something out of the Old Testament where we're mostly focused on the Old Law, but if you look at all 66 books of the Bible, you can find how they point to Jesus. And if anyone wants to challenge that point, then we can certainly talk afterwards, but Jesus is ultimately where we should land on after reading the book of Judges. The one righteous and selfless judge that can provide something that these judges didn't. Jesus embraces every strength that these judges had, but isn't held back by any of their weaknesses. So ultimately, when we read the book of Judges, we read about a broken people and a faithful God, and we should ultimately be looking to the one judge who is righteous and who will bring a better deliverance than the ones we read about. So, are there any other?
So blessed then, aren't they?
Amen. So, are there any other closing thoughts, comments, questions?
Well, I think there's some encouragement there, personally, and that is that even if you are human and you have your faults and frailties, you can still serve God.
Absolutely.
Okay, but you got to put that stuff behind you. You know, when you look at chapter 11 of Hebrews, we can probably pick on any of them, but look at Noah. Noah is, you know, of all the people that lived on the earth at that time, he and his family were the only ones that were righteous before God.
Right.
And God told him to do something which we would have considered impossible. And he did it. Okay? And he saved the human race in doing it. He still stumbled at the end of his life.
Right.
Okay? And right after Jephthah is mentioned in Hebrews 11, David is mentioned. Okay? And we can tell stories about that.
Oh, yeah.
So,
All day long.
But the idea is that regardless of what we've done, Saul of Tarsus, regardless of what we've done in the past, we can turn around.
Absolutely.
Repent and become a servant of God.
Absolutely. Thank you all for your attention.